Good afternoon. Last year, a pharmaceutical company in Sweden set up a scheme called Friend Care. This scheme gave employees a little bit of money each month and a little bit of time off to spend with friends. Sounds like a nice idea. The background behind it, however, is more troubling. The government found that 14% of adults in Sweden say they feel lonely almost all of the time. Increasing work hours, fractured communities, a digital online world has caused what some are calling an epidemic of loneliness. We find the same pattern in the UK. So in 2021, YouGov polled UK adults and found that 7% of adults in the UK say that they do not have a single close friend. If this shocks us, it's probably because it goes to the heart of something that we know really deeply. Friendships matter. When we go through a difficult time, we might have experienced a gift of friendship as something that feels God-given. Perhaps when we've supported a friend through something difficult, it's a time where our faith feels alive and active. Yet, if we turn to Christian theology to try and find some solutions and answers to this epidemic of loneliness, we find something quite surprising, which is the church has had very little to say about friendship. For a snapshot of how little attention is given it, in 2020, the Church of England published a document, Living in Love of Faith, which was meant to be a guide to how the church navigates issues around sexuality and marriage, and it was meant to look at the whole realm of human relationships. But when you turn to the section on friendship, it's given just 2 pages. And those 2 pages are given over entirely to talking about friendship as a way to disagree well about sex and marriage. It's as if sex and marriage are the only relationships that really matter, and friendship is second rate. And where theologians have talked about friendship, there's something possibly even more surprising, which is it's often seen in a very negative light. It's seen as distracting us from our call to love God and to love our neighbour. So today, I want to do something different. I want to argue for a positive theological understanding of friendship and how we can see friendship as one of the places where we find God present and at work in our ordinary lives. I'm going to do this in 3 parts. So first, we're going to explore why Christians have been so uneasy about friendship. Then we'll look at the work of St. Augustine, Elred of Rievaulx, and Simone Weil, who are theologians who in different ways have tried to defend friendship. And thirdly, we'll go to the book of Ruth in the Old Testament to see how we might talk about friendship today. So the first part, why have Christians been so hesitant to talk about friendship? There are 2 gospel passages that I think highlight the friendship problems theologians have found. So in Matthew 5, Jesus says, "If you love those who love you, what reward do you have? Do not even tax collectors do the same? And if you greet only brother and sister, what more are you doing than others? Do not even Gentiles do the same? Be perfect, therefore, as your heavenly Father is perfect." In this passage, we see the first of the friendship problems. If friends are those who we have chosen to love and be loved back by loving them, might we risk not loving those who are our neighbours? Might we risk not loving those who we struggle with? We find the second friendship problem in Matthew 22, where Jesus is asked what is the most important commandment. He says, "Love the Lord your God with all your heart and all your mind and all your soul." And the second is like it, love your neighbour as yourself. And here we see the second friendship problem for theologians, which is, if we are to love God with our whole being, might the love that we choose in friendship somehow get in the way of loving God? I think at the heart of both of these problems is a question, which is love a finite resource? Is love something we only have so much of? And if we love in one place, we might lack loving in another. And in English, we have one word for love. So you tend to talk about loving your neighbours, loving your friends, even loving your enemies. You love pizza, you love your football club. But in Greek, in the language of the New Testament, and in Latin, there are different words for love. And over time, 2 of these words became pitted against each other, agape and philia. Agape became the word that was used to describe universal love, the kind of love that might be slightly harder to show when we're called to love our neighbour or our enemy. But philia, one of the other words for love, came to be used for chosen love. It came to be used for friendship, what sometimes is called preferential love. We all know that you can't choose your family or your neighbours, but there is some sense in which we choose our friends. There might be someone we went to school with, there might be someone we shared an experience with. But our choice to keep that relationship going over time is a kind of preference we choose. We cannot be friends with everyone we ever meet. So we've got these two general challenges, that the love we show in friendship might get in the way of love of God or of neighbour. But there's another reason theologians have struggled with friendship, which is while they were reading the Bible with one hand, they were more often than not reading ancient philosophy with the other. And ancient philosophers had rather a lot to say about friendship. And it's their views, just as much as what we find in the Bible, that shaped how theologians have talked about or attacked or defended friendship through the ages. So we're now going to look at two of the ancient philosophical approaches. So the two great classical philosophers, Plato and Aristotle, have very different understandings of friendship. And the first is that friendship is a love that takes us to a goodness beyond ourselves. And the second is that friendship is a love which builds up goodness inside ourselves. So firstly, Plato said that if we choose to love a friend, we are loving them because we see something beautiful in them. But that beauty isn't just in them, it's a reflection of a higher beauty, an ideal of beauty, a kind of form of beauty. And so for Plato, when we see that beauty in someone, it sparks in us a beauty that leads us somewhere else to wisdom. It's as if friendship is a step on a ladder to something higher and more eternal. The second approach is that when we choose to love someone, we do so because it builds something good up in us. So Aristotle says 3 different types of friendship. So the first is friendships of utility. So these are the kind of friendships where maybe you share some land together or you help each other in raising your children. And over time, a friendship develops out of mutual support. Then he says there's friendships of pleasure. So these are the people you like to go to the pub with because you like to have fun with them. You make them laugh, they make you laugh. He says these are friendship, but there's a better kind of friendship, which is what he calls friendship of virtue. This is the friend we choose because when we look at them, we see something in their character. We see a goodness inside of them. And by that friendship, they build up goodness inside of us. And he describes this kind of friendship as a friend as another self, the kind of friend who stands the test of time. But where both these philosophers and most ancient philosophers valued friendship, they were often quite restrictive in who they thought could have them. So pretty much, apart from 1 or 2 exceptions, women were not understood to be capable of real friendship because they were not understood to have the intellectual ability to form virtue in the same way as men. And it's basically only until about 300 years ago that you get any positive references to women and friendship in any literature. As soon as women are able to write and publish, suddenly female friendships come into light. They also generally said that non-citizens and foreigners couldn't form real friendships because unless you're committed to the state together, how can your friendship be full as 2 elite male citizens? So we might already ask, if it's all well and good for educated male elites to talk about friendships of virtue, what about friendships of 2 women struggling to survive or 2 slaves fighting to get freedom? Are these friendships not more valuable than those of virtue in the academy? And the second challenge they pose for theologians is that both of their understandings of friendship are about choosing. You choose something beautiful in someone, and that's why you are friends with them. And if you want to see how this has made theologians uneasy through the ages, it all plays out in the work of Søren Kierkegaard, a 19th century Danish philosopher and theologian. I love Kierkegaard, but you do get the sense sometimes that he probably didn't have many friends, which might be why he's quite so skeptical about friendship. And in Works of Love, he writes, "The praise of friendship, and erotic love as well, belongs to paganism. Christianity has misgivings about friendship, simply because preferential love, as in the love we choose in a friend, is actually another form of self-love. So where Aristotle said the friend is another self, Kierkegaard says a friend is an I intoxicated by another I, a new selfish self. For Kierkegaard, because we choose to love what we like in a friend, we get so caught up in that love that we become selfish. And it becomes harder to love the kind of people we might find harder to love. And Kierkegaard goes on to critique Plato's idea of a spark of beauty inspiring us to somewhere higher, because he says it's really easy to love what's beautiful, but it's quite hard to love what is ugly. So he says, what is ugly? It is the neighbour, one who one shall love. The neighbour is the unlovable object. Despite his quite strong wording, Kierkegaard makes a really good point here. If we only love those who we like, we're reminded of Jesus' words, what good is it to love those who love you? In love that we choose, how we push to love our neighbour, how we push to love those who are different from us, how we push to love those we disagree with. In a snapshot, Kierkegaard sketches out all these problems that theologians have grappled with through the centuries, that in choosing to love someone, we might risk the command to love those we don't choose. So for the rest of the talk, I want to take Kierkegaard head on and argue for a positive vision of friendship, where we can understand God at work in them. And to do so, we'll look at three thinkers, Augustine, Elred of Rievaulx, and Simone Weil. So firstly, Augustine. Augustine, born in 4th century North Africa, probably one of the most important theologians in the life of the Western Church, started his life schooled in the great philosophers. But the seismic change that came in his life was his conversion to Christianity, and it becomes the lens for how he understands good and bad friendship. And Augustine is fascinating because he's both deeply skeptical about friendship, and he goes on to explain why. But friendship had mattered so much in his life, he has to find a way to defend it. And so in him, we see this kind of defense of friendship, but there's lots and lots of caveats that we might want to explore. So he begins by sketching out the dangers of friendship. So in his Confessions, which is his kind of spiritual autobiography, he tells a story from his youth where him and his friends stole some pears from a neighboring garden. Kids stealing pears for a garden might not sound like the biggest sin in the world, but for Augustine, it demonstrates the greatest danger in friendship. He says that they stole the pears not because they were nice to look at or had a sweet aroma, not because they were hungry or in need, but simply because his friends delighted in encouraging each other to do something wrong. He describes this as, oh, unfriendly friendship. So his solution is to say that friendship can only be found among Christians. So he defines friendship as agreement in things human and divine. And he writes that true friendship can't exist unless those who cling to each other are welded together by God in that love which is spread through our hearts by the Holy Spirit. He uses an example of a friendship he has with Alypius. Alypius was Augustine's mentee before they became Christian, and they come to baptism together. It's in their baptism that Augustine says their friendship becomes real, and they each share a flaw and a strength that the other doesn't. So Augustine says that while Alypius loves gladiatorial games and violence, Augustine isn't interested in them, so he's able to help Alypius out. But Augustine's flaw is that he desperately longs for sexual pleasure, which Alypius has no interest in, and so he's able to help him out. So here we see echoes of Aristotle's idea where friends are drawn to each other because they build each other up in virtue. But it's not just this that Augustine inherits from the philosophers. On Genesis, he has a pretty dim view of women and friendship. So he says that if there had been no need for procreation, God would have better put two men in Eden, living, talking together equally as two friends. Then goes on to say, I do not see what aid a woman can be to a man other than for giving birth. He's also very influenced by Plato. So he tells the story of how before his baptism, a friend of his died, and he poured out his soul like water upon sand. He was tethered by love to something that cannot last. For him, in placing too much love in a friend, he became pulled away from his true love, which should have been God. And so he gives the second solution to the problem of friendship. He says, if bodies please you, praise God for them and turn your love back from them to their maker, lest you should displease God in being pleased by them. And if souls please you, love God in them, because by them they are subject to change, but in him they are established firm. Without him they would pass away and be no more. So Augustine's ultimate solution to the problem of friendship is that friendships can be good, provided ultimately they direct us back to God. We shouldn't stick with our love of friends too long. So he's made some moves to redeem friendship, but there's a sense in him where friendship is only really a step on the ladder to goodness or to God. But might we want to go further? Might we want to argue that women can be friends? Might we want to argue that friendships are more than just a stepping stone to something else? 700 years after Augustine, in a monastery in Yorkshire, one man, Elred, answers these questions with a decisive yes. So we'll now turn to him. So Elred was a 12th century monk living in the Abbey of Rievaulx in Yorkshire, and he's deeply influenced by Augustine's ideas of friendship, but he wants to go much further, and actually he wants to undermine them in the long run. Monasteries were a kind of lab experiment in the problems of friendship. If you think about monks living in close community together in these closed environments, if monks create friendships, that could get in the way of the harmony of the monastery. And so most theologians were writing in this time for monasteries, and most of them are quite dismissive of friendship. It's that same challenge. If you choose to love one person in particular, how does this impact your love of all? So Elred takes on this challenge in 3 steps. So the first problem that he poses is it okay to choose to love a friend? And to answer this, he goes straight to the source. He goes to Jesus' life. So as you might know, in John's Gospel, there's this reference over and over again to the disciple whom Jesus loved, that among the disciples, there's one that he seems to have a particular love for. So Elred says, lest someone think that friendship is reproachable, our Jesus himself to one person, not to all, did he grant a resting place on his most sacred breast, in token of his most special love, to the disciple whom he loved. Elred is saying, in other words, if Jesus can choose to love one person, why cannot we? The second challenge he takes on is friendship universal? Is friendship something that all people can share? And to do this, he makes a bold claim. He says that friendship is rooted in creation. So the way theologians often picture the world is in 3 stages. There's creation, there's the fall, and there's redemption. So creation is how God intended the world to be, how God made the world to be. The fall, the eating of the apple, is where things go wrong and God's intentions become marred. And redemption comes with Christ, where all things are restored to how they were meant to be. Where some had argued that in redemption we leave friendship behind because we're now called as Christians to universal love, what Elred said is that friendship is the original love that is built into creation. So he says, what forest produces only one single species of tree? That is, if we look to creation, we can see that even trees are bound together in their diversity in bonds of friendship. And for Elred, we see this in Adam and Eve. But if Eve is made from Adam's side, then in them is the original friendship. And he says that in them, in friendship, therefore, all are equal. There is neither superior nor inferior. By saying that friendship was there before the fall, he's saying that it's a gift in creation. And by extension, it's something that all people can share, whether they are Christian or not, whether they are male or female. And he goes way beyond what Augustine is willing to say. And then he takes on the third challenge: is friendship just a stepping stone to love of God? So he begins his book, Spiritual Friendship, with a line. Spiritual friendship is written as a dialogue between a few of the monks talking about friendship. And he begins by saying to one of them, "You and I are here, and I hope that Christ is between us as a third." This sentence underpins the rest of his work. That for him, friendship doesn't just point us towards God, but that in our friendships, Christ is present, just as we are. So he says that those two types of love we met at the beginning, agape and philia, that universal love and that chosen love, they are distinct. Jesus has to command us to love our neighbours and enemies because he knew we wouldn't do it on our own backs. But he says friendship is different. It's to friends only that we entrust our heart and all its content. So we might be called to love our enemies, but we need friends to go deeper with. Towards the end of the book, one of his conversation partners takes the words from 1 John, God is love, and says, can we say that God is friendship? And Elred says, no, we can't say that. Scripture doesn't say it, so we can't go that far. But then he takes the rest of the verse, those that live in love live in God and God in them, and rewords it, one who remains in friendship remains in God and God in them. And then towards the end of the work, we see his masterstroke, where he argues that friendship isn't just a stepping stone. So he agrees with Plato and Augustine that when we love a friend, it's like that love flies aloft to God, climbing the ladder to God. But then he does something completely different. Just as easily as he talks about love descending from friend to God, he talks about that love descending from God back to friend, there to sweetly rest. For Elred, love isn't just an upward motion. It's not just an escape from this world towards God. Love moves up and down between God and friend and back again. The love we have for ourselves, that we have for our friends, for our neighbours, for God, rests in each other, encourage each other, their participation in the same love. Here he takes on that challenge, is love a finite resource? And answers no. Remember his opening line, you and I are here, and I hope that Christ is between us as a third. So while Elred moves us in a new direction of friendship, his world, the monastery, can feel quite far away from 21st century London and the realities of human lives. And it's here that a French thinker, Simone Weil, is really, really helpful. I don't think there's any evidence that Simone Weil read Elred's work, but their conclusions on friendship are very similar. So she describes the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit as the original and perfect friendship, which belongs to the Trinity, and which is the very essence of God. So effectively, God is in some way friendship. And for Weil, the best of human friendships is the image of that same friendship in God. So our friendships are an image of the God or the friendship we find at the heart of God. But for Weil, this can only happen at a distance. So where Aristotle and many had talked about a friend as another self, Weil says you have to take a step back. You have to see someone as they really are. You have to avoid becoming intoxicated by them and understand their story and their history. And it's here that she cracks open this very elitist way of talking about friendship, because for Weil, her life was just as much part of her work as what she wrote. So she saw friendship as solidarity with those who are struggling, and it took her to work in factories, it took her to help the French resistance, it took her to live on the rations of labourers, because she understood that true friendship means entering into someone's world and understanding their story. For her, friendship as a mirror of God was just as much present on the factory floor and in the struggle for liberation as it was in the prayerful life of the monastery. So we've looked at the challenge friendship poses, and we've looked at some of the ways that people have defended it. And I now want to turn to a friendship from the Bible, from the book of Ruth, which gives something, ironically, for something written 2,500 years ago, that feels a lot more modern and real than something we find in the great philosophers. So the book of Ruth opens with a famine in Bethlehem, and Naomi and Elimelech flee to the land of Moab. Moabites were the Israelites' closest neighbours, and is normally the case, they were also their worst enemies. And in time, their sons end up marrying two Moabite women. It's as if to say the disaster of famine wasn't enough. Now the sons of Israel have been forced to marry Moabites. And things keep getting worse. Elimelech and the two sons die, until all that's left is the three widows, Naomi and her daughters-in-law Ruth and Orpah. To be a widow in this world was to be vulnerable and unprotected. And so they begin a long walk back to Bethlehem. Until Naomi stops. She turns to her daughters-in-law and has a change of heart. Go back, she tells them. There are no more sons left in my belly for you to marry. Naomi and Orpah part, but Ruth refuses, and she's said to cling to Naomi. In that moment, I want to argue that their relationship changes from something like mother-in-law and daughter-in-law to one of friendship. One of the roles that a widow in the Bible had was to take a man from her deceased husband's family and raise up sons to carry on his name. This might be the motivation that Ruth was going back to Bethlehem with. But in this moment, Naomi releases her from any obligation. She could go back home, she could return to her homeland. But instead, Ruth makes a choice. She chooses to cling to Naomi. She chooses friendship. Naomi will not take no for an answer, and it leads Ruth to respond in some of the most beautiful words in all of Scripture. Do not press me to leave you, to turn back from following you. Where you go, I will go. Where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, and your God, my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. May the Lord do thus to me, and more as well, if even death parts me from you. Where so much philosophical and theological writing on friendship talked about men's character and virtue, here we see something different. We see friendship bound together in vulnerable bodies. Ruth clings to Naomi. The Hebrew davak, the word for clinging, is the same word used in Genesis when it says a man will leave his family and cling to his wife and they will become one flesh. It's the same word used for when your mouth is so dry that your tongue sticks to the roof of it. It's a word used for friendship in the Old Testament with David and Jonathan. It's telling us that Ruth will not let go, not in this moment, not ever. Where you go, I will go. Where you lodge, I will lodge. Where you die, even there I will be buried with you. So is this just a beautiful description of a human friendship? No, something else is happening in the book of Ruth. Carefully spaced through each scene of the book is the Hebrew word chesed. Chesed is used as the word to describe God's character in the Hebrew scriptures. It's sometimes translated as loving kindness or faithfulness or steadfastness. It's what makes God God. It's what makes God different from the other gods. The thing is, in the book of Ruth, God is a bit of a background character. He appears at the very beginning and the very end, but nowhere else. So is God absent in the book of Ruth? What I want to argue is that placing this word chesed in each scene on the lips of the characters is telling us that God is not absent in the story, but is found in human beings and in their friendships. What the book of Ruth describes is real human, earthly friendships embodying who God is, becoming a place where God is active and God is found. Not in ivory towers, not in the writings of male philosophers, but in a foreigner, in an outsider and a migrant, in a Moabite, in a woman, in a widow made vulnerable by her situation. It's found in someone who made the choice to love one person in particular, not just with heart and mind, but with body as well. So what does all of this mean for us today in our calling and vocation as Christians? Well, I think it means three things. It matters for three reasons. The first is that if the church is to face this crisis of loneliness, it has to take friendship seriously. It has to find a way to speak about friendship well, ways to create spaces in which friendships can be found and forged and continued. As we face an increasingly isolated society, and as the church is called to serve those around us, it has to put friendship somewhere at the centre. The second is from really my experience, I think, as a priest. I'm aware of my congregation here, so I don't want to dob you in, but I think it's fair to say that most of us feel that we are just not very good Christians most of the time. The church often suggests the best way to live out your Christian life is to give as much time to church as you can. our ordinary lives can sometimes feel like a distraction. But if we understand friendship as a place where God is found just as much as in prayer or at the food bank, how might it help us understand when our Christian life is being God's presence to others and receiving God's presence from them? The third reason I think it matters is that the story of Ruth and Naomi show us something that male philosophers missed through the ages, that there is something really political in friendship. Friendships can break down barriers of class or religion or ethnicity. They can create networks of support and of liberation. And so in an increasingly fractured world, what might a positive Christian vision of friendship say about how we cross the divides and the challenges we face? Rather than friendship to an elite, what we see in Elred of Rievaulx and Simone Weil and the story of Ruth and Naomi is something more earthy, something more grounded, something more similar to the messiness and complexities of our lives. We see friendship where God is present. Through this way of seeing friendship, we can discover a theological understanding that sees friendship not as a distraction from love of God or neighbour, not as a step on the ladder to something higher, but instead a gift in itself for us to treasure. Friendship as one of the places where we find Hesed, God's loving kindness and steadfastness in us and in the person before us. Thank you. It's a subject that people deal with a lot, actually. Anyone who's writing on friendship also talks about the failure of friendship. And I think there's a kind of spectrum. So I think Aristotle would probably say that those friendships that fail were never true friendships in the first place. They were always rooted in something else. But there were much more kind of positive articulations of friendship being something that naturally changes as your circumstances change. The place you see it most is in discussions of death, actually, and the death of a friend. So C.S. Lewis talks about his friendship with Tolkien, and there was another friend, I can't remember the name, who he was never particularly fond of. And then when this friend dies, he thinks that Tolkien's friendship is going to grow and his friendship with him is going to get better. But he realizes that what that friend did was cause something in Tolkien that enhanced their friendship. And that he almost lost something as something was taken from the equation and from the circle. And I think the reality is, like, you know, that kind of friendship you have where you can see someone after 20 years and it's like you never parted. Distance isn't so much an issue and time isn't so much an issue, but sometimes the circumstances of life just get in the way and then we find someone again. And I guess sense that, or I would just say that when we get to heaven, we will find them again there. I think Augustine would say that's not the case. But there is something really curious in the frequency with which people writing on friendship seem to think of love as a finite resource that kind of runs in the face of, I think, most of our experiences, which is that love doesn't compete. Your children don't compete for your love, do they? If you have more than one child, you kind of, the love grows somehow. But is there all the way through these writings, is this real fear of what it might mean to love one person in particular? And Elred is really clear. He says there's three types of, he calls them spiritual Sabbaths of love. And he's like, you have to be able to love yourself in order to be able to love someone else. And you have to be able to love someone else and able to be able to love God. And for him, it's like they dwell with each other and they build each other up and they encourage each other. But he's like surprisingly rare in the voices that are speaking about it. And it does make you kind of wonder what, I think for Augustine, love is finite because he is so conscious of his life before he became Christian. And he's so conscious of what it was that was holding him back from God, that he sees it more as a competition between what came before and what came after. But I think maybe for writers like Elred, who are writing in an entirely Christian culture, there isn't that same tension at work. Yeah, but it's curious. I think it's that the Protestantism particularly has been even worse than Catholicism about talking about friendship. And so it's just not, you do find people like C.S. Lewis writing about it, and there's a Jamie Taylor writes about friendship, but pretty absent in any kind of Protestant discussions of what a full human life looks like, what human flourishing looks like. You have this curious thing that happens at the Reformation. So before the Reformation, what was seen as the highest state of life was to be a monk or a nun and give yourself over to prayer. And Luther says, quite rightly, that the farmer in the field is just as much glorifying God as the monk is in the abbey. And then the monasteries go. And so the only kind of form of human life which is then acceptable is marriage. And then suddenly to be unmarried becomes it becomes in some ways abnormal. And so friendship gets pushed out. And then another change happens in the 19th century, which is basically people like Sigmund Freud and stuff introduce ideas of sexuality into how we understand human nature. So if you look at kind of pre-Victorian novels, you might have two kind of spinsters living together. They start to disappear into the 20th century because the suspicion is that everything is really about sex. And so if you have two unmarried people living in a novel together, there must be something else going on. And so we, as a culture, we kind of pushed friendship more and more out of how we understand real human life. And the church did that just as much. And so I think the reflection of the 2 pages, I think, is just a lack of imagination that friendship could even be important or something that's worth paying attention to. I don't think it's something I ever had in any of my training talked about, which is ironic because the church has such a focus on trying to build community, but you kind of ask at what cost? Well, what's the purpose if it's not to form deep relationships of love with each other? I'm slightly worried it's because the church thinks the purpose is to increase numbers in the seats and to get more volunteers rather than worrying about the quality of human relationships. Yeah, absolutely. It's one of the worst questions. You know, when you meet someone and say, "What do you do?" It's such a strange starting point of how you want to understand the human being in front of you. It goes back to, I think Simone Weil says about actually to have real friendship, you have to have some distance. You have to want to see someone in their entirety and observe them in their entirety and know them in their entirety rather than getting out of them what you want to get out of them, which is, I want to understand your social status. I want to understand what's interesting about you. It's not just as a priest, it's at a party, if the first question is, what do you do? It normally is a conversation killer. And I think there's far more interesting things we could be asking. There's a German sociologist, Hartmut Rosa, who talks about resonance, and he basically says, he kind of analyzes why depression is becoming more common in the West. And he says we're on this super speed drive to become our authentic selves, the kind of living out the spirit of the 60s, that we are able to become who we are, be all that self-actualization, all that kind of stuff. And he says it's just exhausting. It's really, really tiring. And you see from the 60s, rates of depression skyrocketing. And he says the solution to it is resonance. And if you think of 2 tuning forks next to each other, they start to kind of reverberate in relationship with each other, but they never drown each other out. They keep their own sound. And he talks about the need to create relationships of resonance where you're actually listening to someone rather than using them as something to get something out of. And I think the church, in the frantic drive to kind of save itself on all the activities that we are trying to do all the time, actually just creating some spaces where you can hear someone's story is one of the biggest gifts we can do, particularly if someone feels their story is not being heard. I would say the opposite, in that I want to try and argue that friendship is actually more political and radical than other forms of human relationship. I was going to talk, if I'd had enough time, about the musical Pride. So I don't know if you've seen the film Pride, but it's based on a group, Lesbian Gay Support the Miners, who provide support to a small mining village in South Wales called Onllwyn. And through this unlikely connection, friendships develop. And then there's a musical that's come out recently. I was going to talk about it because it was Pride yesterday. I thought it was a good way to shoehorn it in. And there's a song that begins about friendship. And those friendships that were born in the 80s are still going today, kind of 40 years on. But he talks about friendship entirely in terms of solidarity and entirely in terms of comradeship. And then goes on at the end of the musical, it talks about as the mining community sees HIV/AIDS kind of rip through the gay community and tear it apart, they become the first union to enshrine LGBT rights in their constitution, which then kind of goes on to change the course of history. And that I think there's no division there between the friendship and the comradeship.